Right now, in one of the most strategically sensitive waterways on Earth, something unusual is unfolding. U.S. military forces are not just present in the Gulf of Oman. They are actively enforcing control over it. Civilian ships are being issued warnings. Maritime routes are being monitored in real time. And a corridor that carries a massive share of the world's energy supply is no longer operating freely. This is not a routine deployment. It is not a symbolic move. It is a functional blockade. At first, it appears to be another chapter in the long and volatile standoff between the United States and Iran. But the scale of this action suggests something more calculated, because this is not just any region. This is the narrow gateway leading into the Strait of Hormuz, where nearly 20% of global oil flows every single day. So the real question is not simply why this is happening. The real question is what this action is meant to set in motion. Because once a critical artery of the global economy falls under direct military control, the effects do not stay contained. They spread outward, into energy markets, into geopolitical alignments, into fragile systems that depend on uninterrupted flow. And what we may be witnessing is not just escalation, but a shift. A shift where military pressure, economic leverage, and systemic risk begin to merge. A shift that could quietly redefine how power is exercised in a deeply interconnected world. To understand why this moment matters, you have to look at where it is happening. The Gulf of Oman is not just another body of water. It is the outer gateway to the Strait of Hormuz, one of the most critical choke points in the global economy. Every day, roughly a fifth of the world's oil supply moves through this narrow corridor. Tankers carrying energy from the Middle East to Asia, Europe, and beyond must pass through it. There are no easy alternatives, no scalable detours. If this route is disrupted, the effects are immediate and global. In the days leading up to April 13th, tensions in the region had already been rising. U.S. naval forces were increasing their presence. Surveillance activity intensified. Then came a clear signal. A maritime advisory was issued to seafarers, warning that U.S. military operations were actively being conducted in the Gulf of Oman and the Arabian Sea. This was not a vague caution. It was a direct indication that movement in these waters was now subject to military oversight. And then, it crossed a line. The United States began enforcing what can only be described as a functional blockade, not declared in the traditional sense, not announced with formal language, but implemented in practice. Ships entering the area were no longer moving freely. Their routes were being monitored, their actions observed. The implication was clear. This was no longer a neutral shipping lane. It had become a controlled space. Here's why this matters. Unlike previous military deployments in the region, this action is not just about deterrence. It is about control. Control over a choke point that the global economy depends on. And that changes the equation entirely. Because when control replaces deterrence, the risk profile shifts. The threshold for escalation becomes lower. The margin for error becomes thinner. The timing adds another layer. This move comes amid a broader escalation involving Iran, where diplomatic efforts have failed to produce a stable outcome. The region is already volatile. Proxy conflicts are active. Military assets are positioned across multiple fronts. And now, one of the world's most sensitive trade routes is being directly influenced by a single military power. Multiple actors are now tied to this situation. The United States, enforcing presence. Iran, facing increasing pressure. Commercial shipping operators, forced to navigate uncertainty. And major economies, quietly exposed to any disruption in energy flow. Even countries far from the region are now indirectly involved, because their energy security depends on what happens in these waters. And this is where the situation becomes more complex, because this is not happening in isolation. It is unfolding within a global system that is already under strain. Energy markets are sensitive. Inflation remains a concern in many economies. Supply chains are still adjusting after years of disruption, and now a critical artery of that system is under pressure. So while this may appear to be a regional military development, the data tells a different story. This is a systemic pressure point, one that connects military decisions with economic consequences on a global scale. And once that connection is activated, the effects are no longer predictable. To see what is really happening here, you have to break this down into layers. Because on the surface, it looks like a military maneuver, but underneath, it operates on a completely different logic. The first layer is the most visible: military control over a strategic waterway. By positioning naval forces in the Gulf of Oman, the United States is not just signaling strength, it is creating a controlled environment. Every vessel that passes through can now be observed, tracked, and if necessary, intercepted. This is not about destroying targets. It is about shaping behavior. Ships adjust routes. Operators recalculate risk. Insurance premiums rise. And without firing a single shot, movement begins to change. But this is only the beginning. The second layer is strategic pressure. A blockade, even an undeclared one, functions as a tool of coercion. It does not need to stop all traffic. It only needs to introduce enough uncertainty to disrupt normal operations. For Iran, this creates a narrowing space. Its ability to project influence through regional waterways becomes constrained. Its economic channels face indirect pressure. And perhaps more importantly, it is forced to respond under conditions it does not fully control. This is where the risk begins to build, because strategic pressure invites reaction. And reaction, in a tightly compressed environment like the Gulf, can escalate quickly. A misinterpreted maneuver, a drone entering the wrong airspace, a vessel that fails to comply. Any of these could trigger a chain of events that neither side originally intended. The system becomes sensitive, volatile, prone to sudden shifts. And then comes the third layer, the one that is less visible, but far more consequential. System vulnerability. The modern global economy is built on efficiency, on the assumption that key routes remain open, that energy flows without interruption, that logistics networks function continuously. But this efficiency comes with a trade-off. It creates dependence on specific nodes. Chokepoints like the Strait of Hormuz are not just important, they are critical. Remove or restrict them, and the effects cascade. What the current situation reveals is how fragile that system really is, because control over a single entry point can ripple outward into multiple domains. Energy prices respond almost instantly. Markets begin to factor in risk. Governments reassess supply security. And all of this happens before any large-scale conflict even begins. This is why the blockade matters. Not because of what it has done so far, but because of what it exposes. A structure where military action does not need to be large to be effective. Where influence is exerted not through destruction, but through control. And where the most powerful move is not escalation, but positioning. But this is where it becomes even more unsettling. Because once this model is established, it does not remain isolated. Other actors observe, they learn, they adapt. And the idea of controlling key nodes in the global system becomes a viable strategy, not just for one country, but for many. And that changes the nature of conflict itself. It shifts from battles over territory to control over flow, from visible confrontation to quiet leverage, from war as an event to pressure as a constant condition. And if that shift is already underway, then what we are seeing in the Gulf of Oman may not be an exception. It may be a preview. What makes this situation different is that it is not theoretical. The signals are already visible, and they are coming from the ground level, where global systems meet real-world constraints. According to maritime advisories reported by Reuters, vessels operating in the Gulf of Oman and the Arabian Sea are now receiving direct warnings. These are not generic alerts about regional instability. They specifically reference ongoing U.S. military operations. That alone changes behavior. Shipping companies do not wait for conflict to escalate. They respond immediately to risk. Routes begin to shift. Some vessels choose to delay entry into high-risk zones. Others reroute entirely, even if it adds time and cost. Insurance premiums start to climb, reflecting the increased uncertainty. And in an industry where margins are tight and schedules are critical, even small disruptions begin to accumulate. This is how pressure is applied without confrontation. No ports are destroyed, no fleets are sunk. But the system starts to bend, and it does not stop at logistics. Energy markets are highly sensitive to any signal coming from this region. The Strait of Hormuz is not just another transit point, it is a bottleneck for global oil supply. When control over its outer gateway becomes uncertain, markets react before physical supply is even affected. Prices begin to move based on expectation. Traders factor in risk. Governments begin contingency planning. This is where perception becomes reality. Because if enough actors believe disruption is possible, they act as if it is already happening. And that behavior alone can tighten supply, increase costs, and trigger wider economic effects. The Guardian's analysis adds another layer to this. It frames the situation not just as a regional escalation, but as part of a broader systemic strain. War in this context does not exist in isolation. It intersects with existing global challenges: energy dependence, economic fragility, climate pressure. And that intersection creates compounding risk. For example, increased instability in oil supply can slow down energy transitions. Countries may double down on fossil fuels to secure immediate needs. Climate goals are delayed. Investments shift. And a military event begins to influence environmental outcomes in ways that are not immediately visible. At the same time, the geopolitical environment becomes more unpredictable. When a major power enforces control over a critical route, it sends a signal to others, not just about capability, but about intent. And that signal is studied closely by both allies and rivals. So the case study here is not a single incident. It is a pattern where a localized military action begins to produce global responses, where economic systems adjust before physical disruption occurs, and where the boundaries between military, economic, and environmental domains start to blur. And this is what makes it dangerous, because the system is no longer reacting to events alone. It is reacting to the possibility of events. And that creates a feedback loop, one where anticipation drives behavior, and behavior amplifies instability. At that point, control becomes harder to maintain. And the line between strategy and unintended consequence starts to fade. Once this kind of pressure is applied to a critical node, the impact does not stay contained. It begins to expand outward, layer by layer, across multiple systems that are already under stress. The first and most immediate effect is on the global energy system. Oil does not need to stop flowing for the system to react. It only needs to become uncertain. When a route like the Gulf of Oman is placed under military oversight, every shipment passing through carries additional risk. That risk translates into cost, and that cost spreads. Fuel prices begin to rise. Transportation becomes more expensive. Production costs increase across industries. What starts as a localized military move begins to show up in inflation data thousands of miles away. But this is only the surface level. Because energy is not just a commodity, it is a foundation. Modern economies are built on the assumption that energy is available, predictable, and stable. When that assumption is weakened, the effects ripple through financial systems. Markets become more volatile. Investors shift towards safer assets. Governments are forced to reconsider reserves, subsidies, and emergency measures. And this is where the pressure compounds. At the same time, the military dimension continues to evolve. A controlled maritime zone is inherently unstable when multiple actors are involved. The United States is enforcing presence. Iran is under pressure to respond. And in a confined environment like this, responses do not have to be large to be dangerous. A single miscalculation can trigger escalation, not because either side intends full-scale conflict, but because the system leaves little room for error. This creates a paradox. The strategy is designed to apply pressure without war. But the conditions it creates make accidental escalation more likely. The closer forces operate, the higher the chance that something goes wrong. And once that threshold is crossed, control becomes much harder to re-establish. Now expand this further. The Guardian points to a deeper layer of impact, one that goes beyond energy and military dynamics. A prolonged conflict in this region does not just affect oil supply, it disrupts the global transition away from it. When energy security is threatened, countries fall back on what is available. Fossil fuels become a necessity, not a choice. Investments in cleaner alternatives slow down. Long-term climate strategies are pushed aside by short-term survival. And this creates a second form of instability. Not immediate, not visible in daily headlines, but cumulative. A delay in energy transition today compounds risk in the future. It increases dependence on the very systems that are now under pressure. It reinforces the cycle. At the same time, geopolitical alignment begins to shift. Countries that depend heavily on Middle Eastern energy start reassessing their positions. Alliances are tested. Neutral actors are forced to take sides, even indirectly. Major powers observe closely, not just for the outcome, but for the method. Because what is happening here is not just an event. It is a demonstration. A demonstration of how control over a single choke point can influence multiple global systems at once. Energy, economy, security, climate. And once that demonstration is understood, it does not remain isolated. It becomes a model. And that is where the real impact lies. Because if multiple actors begin to apply the same logic to other critical nodes, the global system does not just become unstable, it becomes fragmented. Different powers controlling different flows, different regions operating under different constraints. At that point, the idea of a single, interconnected global system begins to break down. And what replaces it is something far more uncertain. At this point, the situation begins to look different, because what appears on the surface as a military escalation is in reality something more structural. This is not just about the United States and Iran. It is not even just about the Middle East. It is about how power is being exercised in a system that no longer depends on direct confrontation to produce global effects. The key insight is this: control has become more effective than conflict. In the past, wars were defined by visible outcomes: territory gained, forces destroyed, lines redrawn. But in this case, none of that is necessary. By positioning itself at a critical junction, the United States is able to influence flows without interrupting them completely. Oil still moves, ships still pass. But everything happens under a layer of pressure that did not exist before. And that pressure is enough. Enough to shift market behavior. Enough to force strategic recalculations. Enough to introduce uncertainty into systems that depend on stability. The power is not in stopping the system. It is in shaping how the system operates. This is a different kind of leverage, and it explains why this moment feels unsettling, even without a large-scale conflict unfolding, because the effects are already visible, but the trigger remains limited. The scale of impact does not match the scale of action, and that imbalance is where the real tension comes from. But there is another layer. The Guardian's framing introduces a broader connection, one that links this military action to long-term global risks. When a conflict begins to interfere with energy systems, it does not just affect prices. It affects priorities. Governments shift focus toward immediate security. Long-term strategies, including climate transition, are delayed or weakened. and this creates a convergence. A military move influences energy stability. Energy instability affects economic decisions. Economic pressure reshapes environmental policy. And all of it feeds back into geopolitical tension. What starts as a regional action becomes part of a larger loop where different systems begin to interact in ways that amplify risk. This is the point where the story changes, because it is no longer about a blockade. It is about a pattern where global systems are not just vulnerable, but interconnected in ways that allow pressure in one area to cascade into others. A pattern where control over a single node can influence outcomes far beyond its immediate geography. And once you see that pattern, the implications become harder to ignore. Because this is not a one-time event. It is a method that can be repeated, adapted, applied elsewhere. Other choke points, other systems, other regions. And each time the impact compounds, because the system becomes more aware of its own fragility. So the real shift is not just in what is happening, it is in how it is happening. Power is no longer defined by how much force is used. It is defined by where that force is applied, and how it interacts with systems that the world depends on, but cannot easily replace. And once that becomes the dominant logic, the nature of conflict changes. Not louder, but deeper. Not more visible, but more pervasive. At the beginning of this story, it looked like a single move, a naval deployment, a warning to ships, a tightening of control in a distant body of water. But by now, the picture is different. What is unfolding in the Gulf of Oman is not just a regional maneuver. It is a signal that the rules of influence are shifting, that control over critical systems can now produce effects once reserved for full-scale conflict, and that these effects can emerge quietly, without a formal declaration, without a clear beginning or end. The blockade, whether temporary or prolonged, has already done something significant. It has exposed how much of the global system depends on uninterrupted flow, how vulnerable those flows are to targeted pressure, and how quickly uncertainty can spread once that pressure is applied. But the outcome is still unclear. Because this kind of strategy does not resolve itself quickly. It lingers. It evolves. It invites responses that may not be immediate, but build over time. And with each response, the system adjusts, often in ways that are difficult to predict. So the question is no longer whether this matters. The question is what comes next. If one choke point can be influenced this way, others can too. If control proves more effective than confrontation, more actors may adopt it. And if that happens, the global system may not collapse, but it may begin to fragment, gradually, quietly, under pressure that is applied not everywhere, but in just the right places. And that is what makes this moment important. Not because it is loud, but because it is precise. Not because it changes everything overnight, but because it shows how everything can be changed, without most people even noticing when it begins.